which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. Now, we talked just briefly last week about the providential working of God, and I think that we see it a great deal right here. God hears our cries, and I'm talking about the people of God. He hears our cries, and of course, we're told in the New Testament, we're told throughout the Bible, God knows everything, and therefore God knows my suffering. He knows my trials and my difficulties, just as He knew the trials and difficulties of His people here in captivity or headed into captivity, and He knew, or in captivity, He knew exactly what they were dealing with. Now, when God hears our prayers, our cries, how does God answer those prayers? Well, as we look throughout the Bible, and of course we know, especially in the Old Testament, coming up through the New Testament, you have God working miraculously. We know today God doesn't work miraculously. So how would you suggest that God answers our prayers, hears our cries today? Pardon?
Providential.
All right, providential. And we see God working providentially even during the times when God worked miraculously. The point I'm getting at is that God, when He works providentially, oftentimes, who does He use to help answer the cries and the call of His people? His people. Sometimes He uses His people to answer the cries and the calls and the difficulties that His people are facing. And so we see through that God's providential work. But now, how many of us, and I say this quite often of myself, there are far too many times that I'm not thinking and I'm not thinking spiritually. I don't have my spiritual glasses on. I don't have my spiritual thoughts in my head. And there are times when I know that I have let opportunities go right by me, and maybe at some other place or point in time, I stop and I think, why did I overlook that? Why did I let that go? Was it because I just didn't care? Was it because I wasn't thinking about souls? You know, that's something that I think we have to train ourselves to do, is to be thinking constantly about souls and about opportunities to be able to say things, to do things that may open up a door that might lead someone to Jesus Christ. Vance called me today. He was thinking about a person today that both of us know and about their spiritual status, and brought some things to my attention. Well, I appreciated that very, very much, because I wasn't thinking about that person. And it just so happened, maybe because of the proximity of some things, I might have an opportunity there where he may not have that opportunity. And I appreciate him that he's thinking spiritually. He had on his spiritual hat or his spiritual glasses, whatever you want to call them, and he's thinking along those lines. Well, how many times has God sought to use you or to use me, and we, like Moses, didn't want any part of it? We just did not either care enough, or we just not focused enough, we're just not concerned enough, and so we let that go by, or we push it to the side. Now, make no mistake about it, what if I do that? What if God wants to use me providentially to be able to bring someone to Him? And I say no. You've got somebody out there that is searching and crying out for the truth. We had a visitor last night in our assembly. I believe, if I understood properly, she's been in Jasper 5 or 6 years. Had some questions in our Bible class last night. Had some conversations with her today. She has a Jewish background. She has a denominational background. And in the course of our conversations, it became pretty evident to me that she is honestly seeking and searching for the truth. And she's confused. And she doesn't understand why so many people are saying that they are following the same Jesus but doing so many different things. And I asked her, I said, out of curiosity, why did you come to our assembly tonight or last night? She said, I was on my way to the grocery store or coming home from the grocery store, passed by, saw that you were having service, pulled in, came in, sat down. Now, I can't prove to you that that's God's providence, but I'll tell you what. Well, what are we at 6th Avenue going to do? Well, thankfully after services last night, people Zoomed over and she commented today about how friendly and outgoing everybody was and how everybody welcomed her. And she said, I'll definitely be back. And in the process of our conversations today, she said, I'm open to learn. Well, what if nobody had said anything to her? What if she had left not impressed in any shape, form, or fashion, and God had intended to use us providentially to bring her to Him? Now, make no mistake about it, if we turn it down, God will get somebody else. And I am absolutely convinced of that. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 6, blessed are they that hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. And God will, and is that not what Mordecai basically said to Esther? You know, if you turn this down and you don't do this, God will get somebody else. He'll find deliverance for His people another place, another way. What I want to do individually and what we need to do collectively, individually, all together, is we need to train ourselves to be thinking spiritually. I might as well confess, far too many times I allow and I have prejudged and I've said they just wouldn't be interested. Well, I am thankful for people who never have thought that way. And they go all out in trying to reach people with the gospel of Jesus Christ in any way they can. I am reminded of Acts chapter 16. I think about that a lot. It makes a difference about the kind of heart and the soul. But you remember a vision there and a man pleading, begging, praying for Paul to come into Macedonia. And the word is in the tense in the Greek, keep on. He kept on praying. He kept on begging. He kept on pleading. Well, God's working providentially and He's working powerfully. When you think about 2 Corinthians chapter 4, He has placed the gospel in earthen vessels. Does that pertain just to preachers? No. Sometimes I think we take that passage and we make it just apply to the people who are preaching the gospel in the public forum, and that's not the case. That applies to all of us as His children. And if the gospel be hid, well, we're part of the process in trying to take people. Now, here's something else, and I'm kind of getting astray from, but it's just things I've thought about all day long. This individual that I'm talking about, of course, has various background, Jewish background, denominational background, and some very thoughtful questions, and we talked about some things. But there are hardly anybody, unless it's somebody that's really not religious at all. What I have found over the years, and some of you that have studied with people much more than I have can tell me what your thoughts are on this, but it has become much easier in many ways to study with people who don't have any religious background whatsoever than somebody who has been weighted down with a lot of error. And I have figured out in our conversations, I believe this lady is humble. She's as sweet as she can be. I believe she is earnestly seeking and searching for the truth. But now there's some issues there because of what she has been told all of her life. And it's going to be difficult to get through some of those things. Everybody, unless somebody is just totally not religious in any way, may come into any circumstance or study with some biases, and those have to be dealt with and worked through. And that's the difficulty with some of those things. But now, notice here in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 7, go back there for just a second, please. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now, look at the providence all over that. Notice the descriptives here. The children of Israel were fruitful, increased abundantly and multiplied, waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. And then you see in relationship to that, Exodus 2, 1 through 5, in relationship to the sister then, who through the providential hand of God brings Moses and is able to connect Moses with Pharaoh's daughter, and then the child is then, Moses connected with who? His own mother. His own mother. And he would be raised now in the very home of which occupied the man who had decreed his death. You don't think God, working providentially, can be very powerful? Well, it certainly can be. Drop down to Exodus 3 and 11. Notice what we read there. And Moses said unto God, Who am I, that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? Well, the question of who am I is not really the problem. It never is the problem because of who God is. Now, Moses had been in obscurity for some 40 years in Midian, and then he finds himself on holy ground, and God has selected him to be the deliverer for His people. And he says, Who am I? Well, just think about David. That ruddy young boy, man, however you want to phrase that, who was he? And he went up against Goliath. But the reason he was able to defeat Goliath is, who was the giant that he thought about? God. It wasn't Goliath, it was God that David had on his mind. When you think about Esther, who was Esther to deliver God's people as she did, of course, in the book of Esther? And we can see examples of that time and time and time again. And you know, I preached a sermon here a while back on a Sunday afternoon or Sunday, I believe here. And you know, sometimes you preach a sermon or you put together a sermon and you think, boy, this is good. This is good. And it's not. And then sometimes you put one together and you think, man, I don't know if I really need to preach this or not. And it's really well received. I preached a sermon on Shamgar. Shamgar, very obscure judge, Judges 3 and 30, killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. That was a well-received sermon. Well, who was Shamgar to kill 600 Philistines with an ox goad? Well, no indication that he had any great military training. And I can't imagine killing 600 people with anything, much less an ox goad. But you see, Shamgar obviously had some faith and some trust in God in relationship to what he was tasked with doing. Think about the little maiden in 2 Kings chapter 5 who told Naaman about who? The prophet who was in Samaria. What if she had not told his wife about the connection there? That's a providential hand right there. Well, then he maybe doesn't find out. Or if he's truly seeking truth, as we talked about earlier, God's going to provide a way in relationship to that. Now I'll drop down to Exodus chapter 4. And I was thinking about this as I was trying to work on my outline some. When you open up the Bible, you open it up to the miraculous. You open it up to 6 days of God working miraculously, and man is at the pinnacle of that. And man is a consequence of God's miraculous work. Then God rests on the 7th day. Now, after that takes place, you still see miracles. Now, not in the abundance that you saw in those 6 days, but you still see miracles. You see the flood, and you see things in relationship to that. And you see the confounding of the language in Genesis chapter 11. You see the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 18 and 19. And probably most of you thought about this already, but for some reason, it just kind of hit me that when you get to Exodus chapter 4, it's then that we really begin to see what the ultimate purpose of the miraculous is really all about, of course, after the initial miraculous events that take place. In Exodus chapter 4, we begin to see, and anytime I teach a class or preach on the miraculous, I am never ever going to get very far away from 2 words: revelation and confirmation. Because if you're going to talk about the miraculous, that's what the miraculous is all about. Revelation and confirmation. Now, had a conversation with a young lady several weeks ago, and she's aptly convinced that God is still working miraculously today. And in the kindest way I could say to her, I said, give me evidence. Give me evidence. Do you think she was able to give me any evidence? No, what she said to me multiple times is, I feel and I think. Now, I'm not questioning her sincerity, but what we know is that's how God chose to relate to man, was through revelation and confirmation. Now, when we see the sun, the moon, the stars, we're reminded of Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament sheweth His handiwork. That's revelation. And what we see is We see the face of God in that. Now, if you go down, and I love, right as the sun's going down, it's one of my favorite things to do, is just to take a chair, sit on the beach. At about that time of day when nobody's around, really enjoy doing that. Could care less about it during the day. Like to do it, though, in the evening. There are some places that I have never gone that I want to go, because I have read about them, I've seen pictures. If I could go to the tallest mountain, if I could go to the most picturesque place that you could ever imagine in this world, I could see the face of God, but I'd never know the mind of God. What do I have to have? Revelation. Now, God's revelation, in the sense of showing us His handiwork, is a wonderful thing. I can know there is a God. There's no excuse for anyone to deny the existence of God just in the handiwork of God. No excuse. Romans chapter 1 teaches us that. But knowing the mind of God, it takes different revelation. It takes revelation now that's going to come in a different form or a different fashion. And of course, today that revelation is a written revelation. Now, when you think about revelation and confirmation, there are four, and I've got about 5 minutes. There are about four basic foundational truths that I have tried to put into my mind as I try to teach on the miraculous and try to preach from time to time. And it's like I said, I'm never going to get far away from that revelation and confirmation, because they go together. Just like a hand in a glove, they go together. But now, look at Exodus chapter 4, and notice with me verse 10. And Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. And the Lord said unto him, Who hath made man's mouth, or who maketh the dumb, or the deaf, or the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with thy mouth, and teach thee what thou shalt say. Okay? I'm going to tell you, teach you, put in your mind what you need to say. You don't need to worry about that. Now, that was going to be revelation to him. It was going to be in a miraculous way. And I've always thought it very interesting that Moses said, I'm not eloquent. But his argument was pretty eloquent, wasn't it? And I've also thought it interesting that God then supplies Aaron, but who wound up doing the speaking most of the time? Moses did. Moses did. Well, point I'm making is, okay, don't worry about what you're going to say. I'm going to provide that for you. All right, so there's revelation. Now, when you go back to the first part of the chapter, Moses answered and said, But behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, The Lord hath not appeared unto thee. Now, did God expect Moses? Did he expect the Israelite people? Did he expect Moses to speak to Pharaoh and to all the Egyptians, and then Pharaoh and all the Egyptians would just accept what Moses said? No. No. What was he going to provide? Confirmation for the message. And that confirmation, of course, was going to be a miraculous confirmation. They will now believe what you say, because this is what you're going to be able to do, Moses. Now, when you come from that point up through the Old Testament, is that not the same thing that God provided for the prophets? The message and then the confirmation in relationship to the message. And when you then come to the New Testament, we see Jesus in John chapter 3, and you remember that particular occasion when Nicodemus came, and he said, Rabbi, we know that thou art a teacher come from God. No man could do the miracles you do except what? God be with him. So even Jesus Christ, even our Father in heaven did not expect Jesus to come to this earth in the flesh and preach a message and not have confirmation of that message. And the confirmation came through miraculous means. And we're about to be out of time, but what we'll do next Thursday night, Lord's willing, is look at some of those examples of revelation and confirmation. And I think this is really, really important because I am encountering myself personally more and more people, even in the church, who are wanting to say that God's still working miraculously. And the word miracle is tossed around very freely. And everything seems to be a miracle. And I believe there are some good people in the church that have lost their way in relationship to this. And someone might say, well, what does it make any difference? Well, it makes a big difference. And so we need to be able to give an answer to every man that asketh us of the reason of the hope that's in us with meekness and fear, 1 Peter 3 and verse 15. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. We're out of time. Let's say a prayer and we'll stop right here.